So tell me what happened.
I was there when they crucified him. I can show you where they buried him. What does it matter at this point anyways?
I understand, but just tell me more.
Well, there's this guy named John down by the river. Says all kinds of crazy things. I know, because that's where I go to listen. And one day he says, "Look." So we all looked. "The Lamb of God," he says. That's all we need, right? A lamb. Well, that's the first day I saw him. Jesus, that is.
And you were there too?
I was 3 years. Well, right up until yesterday. It was amazing. He was amazing. And the crowds. Oh, I have never seen so many people in one place. And it was everywhere. Everywhere we went, more crowds. And they came to watch, and they came to listen, and some to criticize, others to be healed. And he touched untouchable people, and they were healed.
So I'm not sure I understand. You say he was healing people, and yet you somehow seem offended?
He told a man his sins were forgiven. People are so naive. Only God can forgive sins. His followers made a mockery of the law. He wouldn't even lift a finger to stop them. He would defend them, and criticize us. Us! I was there that day that he claimed he was greater than the temple. Then the rumors started. Rumors that he would actually destroy the temple. Those ignorant peasants that he surrounded himself believed him. No, they were worse than peasants. Sinners, tax gatherers, women.
He told me about me, the part of me that shames me. But I didn't feel shame that afternoon. Before that day, I can't remember a time I didn't feel shame. But that day I felt alive.
Yeah, but they knew. They knew the entire time we were coming. By then, they knew every move we were going to make. We didn't know who we can trust. But that didn't bother him. So off he packed us into the jaws of lion, Jerusalem.
And the whole world was there. They lined the streets. The sounds of their shouts was deafening. And I'll admit, it went to our heads. But not him, no. No, he seemed preoccupied. I would almost say worried. But I don't think that he ever worried. And then things got weird.
He made Passover all about him. He said the bread was his body, the wine was his blood. But by that point, we were a little used to that thing. But then things got weird even for him. Then he said we were going to get a new covenant. What does that mean? And then we were going to get a new command. We don't need any more of those.
So what was the problem?
The problem? Jesus was the problem. The crowds loved him. They were flocking to him. They just weren't believing him. They were believing in him. That was the problem. So we took care of it.
You mean you killed him?
No, Rome killed him. We were just lucky enough to have one of his disciples lead us right to him. Once we had him in our grasp, those other peasants scattered, just like we knew they would. Let's be clear. We didn't kill him.
So tell me about your order for crucifixion.
Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. I saw more courage and integrity in those eyes than I did any of their high priests. They were jealous. But you can ask my wife. I tried to save him. But as soon as I mentioned the word king, the crowds chanted, "We have no king but Caesar." In that moment, I knew that I had no choice. So I crucified their king. But let's be clear, it was their decision, not mine. But even that doesn't matter now. All that matters now is Passover is done. And things will go back to the way they were before.
So what do you do now?
What do we do now? We hide and we wait.
Didn't he he say he'd be back?
Yeah, he said a lot of things, more than you can write. Like he said that...
You have to understand, I have just spent the last 3 years of my life chasing a wannabe Messiah, a false prophet. I'm not going to spend another minute chasing ghosts. Besides, I have a price on my head, and if I'm not careful, I'm going to be a ghost myself.
Do you think he'll come back?
Well, he wasn't the king or the warrior or the Messiah that we expected, but he did a lot of miracles, and he raised Lazarus from the dead, so maybe he can come back. I'm hopeful. He might come back.
Do you think he'll come back?
Dead is dead.
And what about you?
Do I think he'll be back? Unfortunately, I don't think so.
So one of the things I think that is helpful to name is that these high holidays can be tricky because we can quickly forget that we know the way the story ended, but that doesn't necessarily mean the story was happy when it originally happened. And in some ways, I don't think that's that much different than the lives that you all and we all live. It strikes me that holidays like Easter and Christmas and birthdays, they're either the highlight of your year or the most horrendous part of your year. There's some brutality to them if this is a difficult season for you. And I think we get to name that. And in fact, I wonder if, and I guess I think that, Easter is the perfect time to ask some of the questions that seem out of bounds and unorthodox, but ironically that they seem like the most appropriate questions to the context in which the original story happened. Questions like this one. How have your thoughts about God changed? How have your beliefs changed, or dare I say, evolved over the last year, the last couple years, since someone passed, since the divorce, since you got into middle school, since you got into high school, since your income level hit this point or it dropped to this point? How have your own views of God changed? Maybe since you moved to Helena, or maybe you're visiting since you left Helena. Like what happens if we name that our views of God are constantly evolving? Because it strikes me that some of the conversations that I have that are most thematic, most common, are sitting across from people like yourselves who seem genuine in their desire to trust God and love people, but seem racked with shame, like riddled with the guilt that comes with knowing that what they believe, they're not convinced is what they're supposed to believe or what they used to believe. But what if Easter reminds us that even the original characters were constantly dealing with a changing faith? You know, I think of my own story. I was raised by a mom who went to Catholic school. I remember praying the Lord's Prayer and the Hail Mary every night. Our attendance at church was intermittent. At 17 years old, but I still don't remember a day when I didn't believe in this guy Jesus on a cross. At 17, I started attending what I now know is this very vibrant megachurch. In hindsight, it was a brilliant place, but I sat in the back row and initially didn't know what to think. I remember thinking, like, why is he dressed normal? And the other thing that stood out to me as an introvert is like, you guys need to chill out about the music a little bit. Like, I'd never seen anything like that. Lots of hands and singing. I remember looking at the Bible in front, and I had not spent really any time in the Bible, and I was rather bored and a Beatles fan. And I remember pulling the Bible out and reading the table of contents, and I saw there was a book named Jude. And I'd always wondered who Hey Jude was, and so I spent that service reading about Jude. At 19, if you'd asked me, I would have said I converted. And to be honest, at 20, if you'd asked me when I came to know God, I would have said at 19. And if I died before that, I would have went to hell. You're in that same kind of early 20s era, if we'd have been having a conversation about God and you had let slip that you enjoyed a beer, I'd have said, I thought you told me you were a Christian. You know, fast forward 20 years, and I'm not even saying all my thoughts and beliefs have evolved in the right direction. I'm not claiming that I got it and I didn't then or anything like that, but I just have to acknowledge, like 20 years later, to be honest, and we don't have to agree on this, but I'm just not convinced that the Western European Christian construct of hell is even in the Bible. I enjoy a beer now. I don't think that Jesus turned the water into Welch's grape juice, which, by the way, was its original motivation for its invention. Like, And again, I'm not trying to say we got it right and they had it wrong and look at us, we've evolved to the right place. I've evolved to the right place, but just naming, like our culture and our experiences, they tend to impact the way we think about faith. And if we're not careful, we stuff that. And on Easter, we pretend that it's what it was when we were born. It's what it was when we were 10 or 20 years old, whatever that kind of supposed pristine time was for you. Even the cradle atheist, your thoughts of God or why not God, I'm guessing, have changed. And to me, it's comforting to also see that this is true of history. Like 4,000 years ago, if you just said that you believed in God but didn't believe in sacrificing children to that God, no one would have taken your faith seriously. Not long after that, if you'd have said that you believed in God but you were currently eating a meat from an animal that had been sacrificed to another God, that would have been out of bounds. You can't do that. In Jesus' day, if you were a male who said you were following the Jewish God but hadn't gone through a certain kind of surgery, they would have said, you can't do that. The Sabbath, not observing it, not an option. Think of the medieval ages, and really not even that far back, but it wasn't that long ago that if you just said you take God seriously, but you didn't attend Mass 52 times a year, then the general assumption would have been that your faith is fake. Many of you in your own lifetime, you remember when what was normative was you can't be a Christian and get divorced. And there were all kinds of theological gymnastics that were played in order to say you were never married in the first place. And again, I'm not trying to pick on anyone, just name what is the issue, and that is our thoughts on God are constantly changing. And I think moments like this remind us that either we conclude that it's all relative and God is relative, or we conclude that God is altogether other and bigger, and we're never going to master that God. And that the culture that we grow up in, and the context that we live our lives in, and the experiences that we have shape our views of God. If you've had a dramatic rescue from death, then that second song we sang is a brilliant song, God Will Never Let You Down. If you're grieving tragic loss, I would guess that's a difficult song to sing. Context, culture, it shapes things. But here's to me then what excites me about Easter, because if I'm being honest, and I'm just shooting from the hip here now because it's the 11:30 and the nervousness is gone a little bit, Easter is a really, really difficult weekend for guys like me. Because if you're not careful, you're just kind of playing into a role. But here's the thing for me with Easter this year, for whatever it's worth to you. I think Easter affords us to ask the really big questions and go, okay, so Adam, or you, whoever you are, why are you comfortable identifying with Christian faith and tradition? Why do you still sign up for that? Because no one needs me telling you that there's lots of successes and lots of embarrassing moments. Easter to me is the reminder that there's a single stake in the ground for me personally, and you get to make these decisions yourself. And it's not tied to any kind of moral covenant, and it's not tied to any kind of social construct. It's tied to one historic day. Like the tension of Easter is this: were Jesus' original followers looking for or anticipating a resurrection? Did they think they would see him again? Well, the gospel accounts seem to indicate not a chance. That they expected dead people to do, this dead person to do, what all dead people in their life had done, and that is stay dead. It seems to be why, and I'm indebted to Andy Stanley for many of these observations, but it seems to be why, quite frankly, you don't have any historical account of the disciples sitting outside the tomb like we sit in anticipation for the Super Bowl. Like there was no 10, 9, 8, get your popcorn because it's coming, 7, 6, 5, 4, shh, the show's on, it's about to happen. None of that in history. Rather, there's this general assumption that he was a brilliant teacher who tragically died, and what we thought we had has been lost. Which raises this question, then why are we here? If 2,000 years later, if that was the initial moment, then why are we 2,000 years later still here? You know, the original story, it's in the text. And of course, we all have to agree to what degree that's reliable, and we'll return to that. But in the original account, remember, in the Jewish world, the day starts with night. So you have night before day. So just to kind of set our bearings on this, it is Sunday in the classic Jewish world, but tonight after 3 stars appear, it's actually Monday night. And then tomorrow's Monday, and then when the sun sets tomorrow night, it's Tuesday night. So that's why in the Jewish world, this whole, the 3 days of Easter can get really, really confusing because Jesus died on Good Friday. We call it Friday. But then Sabbath started what we would call Friday night, but that for them was Saturday night. Their Sabbath was Saturday. And so the text says that Jesus died on Good Friday, and then probably Nicodemus and some other guys purchased Jesus' body and the rights to bury him in a new tomb. Some women watched that happen and watched where they took him, but then Sabbath set in. And nobody would dare work on Sabbath. So these grieving friends, distraught and confused, they had no choice but to just recoil into their own homes and figure out what their next steps would be. But Luke says, who is this historian in his own day, Luke says that when Sabbath was over, which means Saturday night by our construct, Sunday night by theirs, when Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and some of the other women decided that they were going to go just further embalm Jesus' body, anoint it with spices. But interestingly, Luke says that when the Sabbath was over, they actually went to go buy some spices, which raises a question. Why did she have to go buy spices? Because if she was anticipating resurrection the way we were anticipating today, she wouldn't have had to have done that. It's but the first clue of perhaps that maybe they weren't even thinking resurrection. There wasn't even a construct that they had. It wasn't the way they were thinking. The Jewish scriptures say shockingly little about life after death. Even in Jesus' own world, the world would have been very, very split by what they even believed about the idea of a future resurrection. And so they're walking to the tomb, having bought spices, with the idea of anointing Jesus' body or embalming it further, and they think to themselves, I wonder who's going to open the tomb for us. Now, to picture their tombs, think like cave with an opening about this tall, lots of limestone in Israel, so potentially either a natural cave or probably more likely at this era, a brand new carved cave, something very affluent people can have, like you have the dude's room, they have their freshly hewn cave that nobody else has used before. And the doorway would have been this round rock with a channel doorway, so they didn't have door hinges, they had channels that would have been rolled in front. So the women are thinking, who's going to open it? But when they get there, when they arrived, they see that the tomb has already been opened. And so they crawl in and they see the linen, they see the stuff on the ground, and their first response is not, yes, it happened. Their first response is, somebody stole the body. And then, of course, and here's where the accounts differ, and historical students would say that actually gives credibility to the accounts. It doesn't take away from it. Some would say 2 people, one would say 1, but someone appeared and told the women, his body hasn't been stolen, he's resurrected. And then, see, what happens next, I think, is of so much importance. If you're a critic of Jesus, if you're still trying to put it back together, if your childhood faith doesn't work for you anymore, if you're trying to make sense of faith in this day, in this era, what happens next, I think, is so important. Because, and Andy Stanley, I love the way he says this, nobody, not Peter, not James, not John, not the sailboat, not Mary, none of them were expecting, nobody was expecting no body. Their assumption was someone stole it. And so they go back to Peter. Having been told by some angel or gardener or somebody what had happened, they go back to Peter and look at Peter's response. Verse 11, but they did not believe the women because their words seemed to them like nonsense. So even Peter, his first response is not like, oh yeah, I knew that was going to happen. He's like, you're crazy. He's dead. Yeah, we hoped he was the Messiah. He's gone. Get over it. Now, I don't know where you currently are in your thinking about Jesus. Probably most of us would, at very least, and maybe this is where you're at, you would go like, well, he certainly was a historical person. And I think that's valuable to acknowledge because, quite frankly, it's very difficult at this point to construct a historical argument that Jesus was a myth, that he never actually existed. There's so many things that historians, whether they believe in God or not, can look back to in this era and go, no, there was a pivot that happened, especially in Western culture. Like we take hospitals for granted. But historians will go, no, that idea, it didn't exist pre-Jesus. Something happened then that shifted that. Before that, if you were sick, if you got sick, you better hope you had a healthy family or you were wealthy enough to hire someone to take care of you. After that, we see this value on caring for people even if they couldn't afford to pay for it, which is not intended to be a political comment at all. I'm just saying like that the reason why you see many hospitals with a saint in their name is because it was a Christian value that carried this idea of healthcare. Same with schools. Pre-Jesus, if you were educated and they weren't, that was your societal advantage. Post-Jesus, there was this general value on, no, we should educate everybody. But here's where we also have to acknowledge we didn't nail it, because mostly we hit that on men, but not so much minorities and women. Pre-Jesus, if you wanted to be safe, you better hope you had the sharpest knives and the longest spears and the biggest cannons. Post-Jesus, there's this value on what we would call a police force, highway patrolmen, sheriffs. It wasn't the general assumption of society. So my point would be, maybe you're someone who's just like, yeah, Jesus was a historical person, but the resurrection, I mean, maybe you woke up this morning, your wife's like, we're going to church. Your husband's like, we're going to church. Your parents are like, we're going to church. And like, oh, this is that one where we get together and we all talk about these kind of giant fabricated idea of resurrection. Here's the good news if that's where you're at with Jesus. I think this is great news for you. If that's where you're at, you're actually in really good company, because Jesus' original followers had that exact same view. They too were of the mindset that Jesus was a brilliant person who tragically died. In fact, we see that. Peter got up. He ran to the tomb. Watch this. Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb. Bending over, he saw the strips of linen lying by themselves, and he went away wondering to himself what had happened. So even Peter, when he finally saw the empty tomb, didn't go like, I knew the movie was going to end this way. He's like, what is this? This isn't supposed to happen. So what happens next is what changes the story. Because the disciples, they're tyrants, they're the cronies of someone who is perceived as a tyrant. They're hiding out, their lives are at risk, and eventually this is when things get interesting and potentially even more difficult to get your hearts around. While they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, peace be with you. He appeared, like this Obi-Wan kind of moment, like bam, he's there. And their assumption was not that all that different than, say, Hogwarts or Obi-Wan. There was this assumption of like, whoa, a ghost. Look at their response. They were startled and frightened, thinking they saw a ghost. So here's the bad news. If resurrection is hard for you to get your brain around, but you can buy into the whole kind of cultural, like, yeah, there's this kind of non-bodily spirit that must have been floating around, and that was Jesus. Actually, the original story demands more of you than that. Watch what follows. He said to them, why are you troubled, and why do doubts rise in your mind? So he has a way of going, don't be afraid, which isn't always easy. But then look at this. Look at my hands and my feet. It's I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have. So his claim, by the way, is not that his spirit kind of rose from his flesh and united with God's perfect kind of spiritual being, and boom, they saw this ghost. His claim was bigger than that. His claim was that he was the physical person who had died and now has bones and is standing in front of them. He keeps going. When he said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. And while they still did not believe it because of joy and amazement, he asked them, do you have anything here to eat? It's crazy. And then watch what happens next. It's like, if you're a ghost, we'll watch the thing go down your gullet, and then we'll close our eyes when it hits your bowel. I mean, I don't know. But here we go. They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence. So you got up this morning going, I had this Easter thing. I have a hard time. The good news is I agree, it's difficult. The bad news is it demands even more than that. Because in my opinion, here's the reality. The Bible has very little to say about life after death, but it has a bunch to say about what N.T. Wright calls life after death. Like, it's a mystery, it would seem, what happens in those moments immediately after your physical death. That piece, the New Testament doesn't have very much to say on, but resurrection points to not a disembodied floating around like, where do we go when we die? I don't know. We know it can't be up because suddenly we realize there's not even an up in the universe. But what the resurrection points to is a God who created physical, material world, who declared it good and very good, who recognizes in the scriptural narrative that evil somehow entered into his story and never attempts to tell us how or why or where from, but does tell us that this God is going to do something about it and invites us to be a part of that with him. And that what we're moving toward is not this kind of floating in the sky, singing endlessly kind of eternity. but a restored, a recreated, a reclaimed, a put back to rights physical existence. Which leaves me believing that there will be trails and baseball and good food. Because the story points to physical things. Listen, Easter's tricky because what happened in the resurrection and why the resurrection, we spent a lot of energy on this last year. And this is for me one of those evolving faith things. Personally, I can't see in the scriptures anymore, or rather what I see is a construct that tells us that what you have is a vindictive, angry God who had to punish somebody, so he punished his son so God could like us again. The good news, if you can't swallow that, is that that wasn't the view that Christians held for the first 11 or so 100 years. That the general sentiment was what they called Christus Victor. They embraced the mystery of it. They acknowledged that evil was present in the world, and the general claim was the mystery of the cross, but recognizing somehow that constituted a victory from God. What was the victory? The death? Seems to me it was the resurrection. That Jesus took evil's best shot and won. And that somehow we were rescued from a tyrant we could not rescue ourselves from, and it points to a physical future. And the disciples are like, what the? He said to them, this is what I told you while I was still with you, which is troubling because what it points to is he actually did say all this was going to happen. So what happened? Well, it's the same thing that happens to you. It happens to me. Their culture, their experience, their pre-existing constructs wouldn't allow them to hear it. It's kind of like when you have this remarkable revelation that your buddy says to you at work or you listen to some podcast and you're like, oh, and then you tell your spouse or your friend or your roommate or something like, oh, and they say, I've been trying to tell you that for 5 years. It's the same kind of thing. Like, we can only receive what we're ready to hear. They had already decided Jesus is the Messiah, and Messiahs win wars, not battles with death. And he says to them, guys, just think back. I've been telling you this. He said to them, this is what is written. The Messiah will suffer and rise from the dead on the third day. And repentance for the forgiveness of sins will be preached in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. And what happens next? Legitimately, honestly, what happens next is for me why 20 years in, as someone who's often catching myself going like, do I still believe the right things? Like, am I committing malpractice when I teach the Bible on Sundays? Because I can look at my past and go like, I don't know that I identify with that anymore, and I don't even know if they would sign off on my faith anymore. Here to me is the binding thing for me. Listen to what they say next. He says this, you are witnesses of these things. See, before the resurrection, Peter ran from danger. After the resurrection, he walked toward it. Before the resurrection, you had a bunch of distraught people thinking that their leader failed them. After the resurrection, you have this movement that pops up. Before the resurrection, there were no Christians. You don't have a bunch of superstitious people trying to keep the idea alive. You don't have a bunch of people who are trying to somehow keep the movement moving. Before the resurrection, you have a dead moment. Without it, we wouldn't be talking about the prodigal son. I firmly believe that. We wouldn't be talking about the golden rule because the teacher failed his own teacher. We don't read the moral observations of our failed leaders because the whole thing fell apart. Before the resurrection, there was nothing left. After the resurrection, you've got a movement. Which is why I think Easter is so valuable, because it reminds us that, and this is where we're going to do a little bit more work next week, and quite frankly, Andy Stanley's done a bunch of work. There's some references on the mind map, but this is why I think we can say with confidence, like, you're not a Christian. Here's the good and troubling news. You're not a Christian because of the Bible. Because long before we had a Bible, there was a movement, and the movement wasn't founded upon any kind of cultural concepts or any 10 commands. The movement was based upon one very simple thing. A day when a guy that people saw die showed up and said, have you caught any fish lately? And do you actually keep any of them so we can eat them? Like that's the moment that changed everything. What if that's the invitation of Easter? I think of Peter. I feel bad. By the way, my fly fishing joke was not a criticism of anyone. It was just one of those random things. So please don't read into that. Thank you for giving fish back so the rest of us can fish, Clint. That's very kind of you. Stuck in my own head right now. Think of Peter. The good news is I can't catch fish and I don't fly fish. So all the fish are safe. Peter believed, and then he stopped believing, and then he claimed he never believed, and then he believed again. Just think about that. Peter, he believed, he followed Jesus. Then when Jesus was arrested, he said, I don't believe anymore. And then when a junior high girl asked him at Jesus' trial, do you still believe? He said, no, I've never believed. And then after the resurrection, he believed again. Here for me is the tie that binds, so to speak. You have 12 disciples. Judas took his own life. The Apostle John seems to be the only one that died of relative old age, though he also took a lot of persecution from Rome, isolated, it would seem, towards the end of his life. Of the 12, then, that leaves 10 disciples. And history will tell us all 10 of them died heinous, horrible deaths within the first 10 or 20 years of Jesus' resurrection. Some were killed with arrows, some were flayed alive. I don't even know what that looks like. Some were burned, some were boiled in oil. Peter was crucified. And Peter, to stop his crucifixion, and mind you, his crucifixion followed his watching his wife and his children be crucified. At least that's what church history has recorded. The only thing Peter had to do to stop it all was really simple. It was to say, hold on, stop the truck. I made it all up. All he had to do was say, yeah, those were a hard few days, and we really couldn't handle the fact that people wouldn't be following us around listening to us anymore, so we fabricated this story. But here's the catch, and listen, can we prove this? Absolutely not. That's why I think it's important that we talk about faith in honest terms. But here to me it's the thing. It's the thing when I disassociate. It's the thing when I'm like, I don't know if I buy into that anymore. It's the thing when I'm like, do I still fit in this tradition? Here's the thing for me. All Peter had to do, all he had to do was say, I didn't see it. I didn't witness it. If you and I, if we were to die for our faith, every time somebody does something beautiful or ugly in the name of faith, we die for something we claim to believe. And that has its place. The 10 disciples, the 11 with John, died for something they claimed to have physically witnessed. They didn't claim to believe it, they claimed to have seen it, and there's a massive transformation that happens in their life. And all that had to happen for Peter to go okay, get him down off the cross, I don't want to watch him die, would be to go, yes, sorry, I made it up. And Rome would have gladly went hold on, shh, everybody quiet down. Peter, tell him what you just told us back there in that room. And all Peter had to do was say, yeah, sorry, I made it up. And the whole thing is gone. So what does it mean to be a Christ follower? And what are the absolutes? And how do we make sense of the cross? I don't have all the answers to all those questions, and I suspect you don't either. But what if our faith comes with a responsibility to think about that stuff, to discern what it looks like to value God and trust God and value people? But what if we don't waver from the fact that to be a Christian, pre-resurrection, no Christianity, post-resurrection, this massive movement that swept the world? It helps me in those moments. And it seems to be even what Paul took up. We'll end with this, but Paul in 1 Corinthians is writing a letter to some people years after Jesus' life and death and resurrection, and he quotes what many would say is the oldest piece of literature in the New Testament. So he's quoting a creed that is often dated within 10 years of Jesus' death and resurrection. He says, "For what I received I pass on to you as of first importance." Now here begins the quote. "That Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. After that he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep." Why is that important? Because he'd have been like, talk to John, talk to Sally, talk to Louie. They all saw it too. They're here. Then he appeared to James and then to the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also as to one abnormally born. And here's the most brilliant piece of this chapter, because 1 Corinthians is the most robust life after death text we have in the whole Bible. It's really the most comprehensive thing we can point to. And ironically, this brilliant chapter full of lots of observations and lots of questions listens to the way this chapter about heaven, quote unquote, ends. He says this, "Let nothing move you. Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain." What does that tell us? Well, if resurrection is about a God who's putting the world back to rights, then what does it mean to be followers of the resurrection? Does it mean that we wait and go like, yeah, it doesn't really matter, you just go to heaven when you die? Or does it mean that God started new creation some 2,000 years ago, and when we go to work in the morning, when we go do what it is we do, whether it comes with a paycheck or not, we get to choose or not whether or not to be co-conspirators in God's kingdom, co-contributors, not just to some like religious ideology, but to the putting back to rights of God's creation. Which means every student that you serve, and every client that you take well care of, and every person that you value. It's the invitation to define what it means to be spiritual, not in some abstract, removed terms, but in some like feet firmly on the ground, God's kingdom started then, and I get to be part of that kind of way. And so we take communion. We're going to do that in just a moment. We'll have elements here, and up in the balcony, though in the balcony you're also always welcome to come down here, and vice versa for that matter. But we do that not because it's some kind of like prescription drug that we take that makes sure that our body gets scanned into heaven when we die. We do that as statements of the victory Jesus won over evil on the cross and the co-participation that is ours when we step into it. And remember, we dip, we don't sip, and also we don't submerge our hands up to our elbow. So if you could also avoid that, that's been a new iteration because we've noticed that there's a confusing thing. So there's just as many germs on your fingertips as in your lips. So there's needle nose pliers there if you struggle with that. God, thank you for the mystery and yet the historicity of this thing that we're a part of with you. Thanks, God, that heaven is not this abstract idea, but it's this feet firmly on the ground opportunity to be co-conspirators with you in your battle against evil. Thanks, God, that you won, that it's not that we don't die, but that we die with you and we live with you. God, we trust you. And would you give us the kinds of relationships that foster even more trust? We love you, God. Amen. Hey, happy Easter. So we had this idea 6 months ago. It sounded like a good one at the time, but we thought, you know what we should do is we should all go to Easter out on the Kleffner Ranch. And it'll be 70 degrees and sunny and there won't be any mud. I'm so grateful, like the Lord is our shepherd, right? Like, wow. Could you imagine the disaster that would be? I mean, we would be covered in mud up to our eyeballs. And you would all be stuck, and David would be pulling you all out with his truck, and it just wouldn't be good. So we're really thrilled to get to share Easter with you here at the Grand Street and to understand this place as we value gathering and gatherings like this where we can provoke conversation and ask questions and hopefully stimulate relationship. And then we also value serving people together, and we call that scattering, and that takes on many, many forms, but really it's founded of this idea that we like this, we value this, we see this kind of fitting in the ecology of what it is that our week looks like, but we also think that this is about serving or propelling us into those other 6 days, not the other way around. And so thanks for helping us scatter yesterday. Hannah's going to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so we had a couple scattering events yesterday on Mount Helena. The first one was the Run for Justice. It was the 9K run all the way around Mount Helena, and all of the proceeds went to a nonprofit called Love Justice International. And if you're not familiar, they are an anti-human trafficking organization, and they do work in over a dozen countries around the world. So we're really excited. We're going to be able to write them a check for over $5,000 next week. So that's pretty exciting. And then the second event we had was our egg hunt. So So we scattered 15,000 eggs up on Mount Helena, and it was done in like 30 seconds. So thanks so much if you were a part of making yesterday happen. We had over 60 volunteers up at the trailhead yesterday morning, and so we really couldn't serve Helena if it wasn't for you guys. So thanks.
I always have this like semi-anxiety attack at like 10:30. This is 2 years in a row. It didn't used to happen, but when the weather is so terrible and I look up on the hill and I realize that we've just littered 15,000 plastic Easter eggs, and then there's this thought of like, what if nobody shows up? Like, it'll take us a week to pick those things up.
I don't know. Montana kids are pretty tough. Like, snow's not going to stop them for free candy.
Well, I'm sure glad they showed up because that would be like the worst scattering event ever. Oh. Yeah, it'd be so bad. So if you came this morning intending to give, you can do so now as the bucket passes by. Otherwise, just let it just fly right by.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.